Thank you. Good morning. I'm Tom Millar from CISA in the United States. We decided to hold this session because, as I'm sure you all know in this room, we face an increasing number of what we call disruptive incidents, which is more than just data breaches, but the incidents that actually affect business operations throughout the globe. And I'm not going to belabor introductions. You've already heard the names of the panelists. I hope that their reputations precede themselves and that the bios in the conference app are sufficient to explain their credentials. So let's get right down to it. First, I want to set sort of like some definitions for everybody in the room, because I'm sure like cyber resilience may not be the a well-defined term, shall we say, in our industry. So folks, we'll start with you, Eireann. What does cyber resilience mean to you?
Wow. I'd say, I lean on Dan Gear's kind of statements in the past. Security is the absence of unmitigated surprise, or the impact, if we're going to talk about resilience. So being able to absorb the impact of surprises and adapt to changing circumstance.
Wendy?
So I'm kind of a purist. I've talked to a lot of people and done some research, and I find that a lot of people feel that preventing the event that you then have to be resilient about is part of resilience, and I don't really agree with that. I feel like resilience is the things that you do after the bad thing happens, and you can practice to be better at that part. But I think the things that you do to try to keep the event from happening in the first place are not part of resilience. I think that's prevention, but I'm a pedant that way.
Yeah, I have a very practical viewpoint on resilience, and I always think back to continuing the ability to operate. So you can have all sorts of bad technical things that can happen, but the ability to just, how does the organization continue to do the key things that it needs to do? And often people look at resilience as being this enormous kind of ethereal concept, but it can be as simple as having pen and paper and some written down phone numbers so that you can continue to do the thing that you needed to do if you didn't have the systems.
So, all right, given that, and I like that these definitions are actually kind of aligned, more or less.
We can try and disagree about a few things.
We'll get to the disagreement soon enough. But let's jump into war stories. So, tell us your favorite cyber resiliency story, and good or bad, what went wrong and right, and how could the team have improved their response to a disruptive incident? We'll go in reverse. Declan?
Awesome. I have a really simple one. This was about me and a great mistake that I made. About 20 years ago, I had a penetration testing consulting company in Australia. And we were, sort of reasonable, like small by global standards, but, about 20 odd people. And we had a couple of racks, as one did in those days, full of various pieces of equipment. And I, wanting to do the right thing, was like, everything has to be documented. We've got all these systems. We need to be able to stand them up and bring them down and maintain them and, all of that kind of stuff. And then we had a power outage one day, and I arrive in the office and I'm like, okay, power outage, air conditioner thing went down, the whole building's gone. Excuse me. We'll just need to have a look at this documentation and work out what order I need to raise all the systems up. And of course, all the documentation's online. And it was so profoundly stupid and funny at the same time. But it really kind of brought home the difference between technical redundancy and actual meaningful organizational resilience. And that's, I don't know, I think that's a nice little framing of things.
So over 30 years ago, I was working for a Swiss bank, and at the time I was based in Chicago. And the Chicago River burst into the tunnels underneath the downtown area, underneath the loop, and flooded the basements of the buildings there. So even though our data center was on the 11th floor, it didn't matter, because when the basement is flooded, you can't have power. So we had to rebuild our production backbone in 2 locations, one outside of Chicago and the other in New York City. And I remember some colleagues of mine carrying a Sun 4 server down 11 flights of stairs in the dark. That's the sort of thing that you don't plan for, and if you made it up as a tabletop exercise, somebody said, oh, that's not realistic.
Hopefully this is working, the microphone.
Resilience.
Resilience, yeah, adapting to new microphones in the face of a very large and knowledgeable audience. Yeah, I think this is probably a very small story. It's not like a big incident. I have a couple of big incident stories, but I'll tell it because it was so surprising to me, and I think that's a theme going through our discussion. So I was doing a penetration test in another country where I don't speak the native language, and we were working on the smart metering system, which had a bunch of pole-top switches. And we were doing some penetration testing of those pole-top switches, 2 of us. And we were told that this was not a production system. So you can all see where this is going. Once we got access to the device, we had to get past some tamper resistance to pop the box open and maybe reboot it. And then we found some directory traversal. And next thing you know, you can see the administrative passwords and so on. And there was this one lovely little parameter of like what the number of failed password attempts is before you set a lockout screen. So I thought it'd be really fun if I just changed this value to -4. And then obviously I was locked out of the same system. So there's a finding, that's great. And then someone comes into the room speaking a foreign language, and they're very panicked. And they ask us what we've just done. And I explain what I've just done. And then I find myself upstairs in another part of the power company trying to bring 600,000 smart meters back online via a translator. To the database admin. He doesn't know what parameter I've changed, and neither do I inside the database. So there's a lot of translation going back and forth just to reset this parameter to something sensible like 3. They can now have visibility over 600,000 smart meters in a major city. And so, you know, there was a finding there that that they were told by the staff that this had been a development system for testing only, and it wasn't. And I didn't have an incident response plan, and even the company had an incident response plan. The management spoke one language, the staff spoke another language. It was crazy, but we adapted, and we got it done in under an hour or so. So I think.
And they never let you back in again, right?
No, they brought us back. I think management felt that we had identified a few organizational risks. I did get a lot of teasing about it, but yeah, good times.
So back to you, Wendy. What do you think are some myths and assumptions about cyber resilience that a lot of people have that we should be considering and possibly like knocking down or myth busting?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this earlier, that I think if you make the word resilience too big an umbrella, then everything comes under it, and then really nothing means anything. I get to do scenarios for a type of tabletop exercise for the Atlantic Council's Cyber 912 Strategy Challenge, which is for college students who are in law and policy and international relations and cyber, and it's a global sort of thing. And sometimes the scenarios that we work with are ones that we don't know how to solve. And I think sometimes it's kind of cheating if you have all the answers worked out ahead of time, because I can promise you that when you're facing an actual event, you're not going to know what the answer is right off the bat. You're going to figure it out as you go along, and that's the strongest thing that you can work on, is improvising and working with everyone. So I would say that's one myth, that you're always going to know the answer. Sometimes you don't always know, even afterwards, whether it was an actual breach or not. So you just have to question everything and be comfortable with not knowing, but going ahead anyway.
So, Declan, I notice you're nodding along.
I'm nodding along. I'm nodding along. I have a thing that I'm quite passionate about, and this is know the difference between technical redundancy and a security trust domain. And so the number of times dealing with ransomware incidents or incidents where you've had like a significant privilege breach, like domain admin or something like that, and people come to us and they say, but we have a redundant data center, but we have backup, we have hot databases, we have all of this kind of stuff. How could the attacker take out everything, the whole, we've just spent all of this money on setting everything up. And when people think about resilience for organizations from a technical level, you're talking about infrastructure people, stuff like that. They're like, okay, so we've got diverse networks, we've got extra switches, we've got high availability, we've got all of this kind of stuff. It's all the same trust domain, Jan hacker comes in, gets domain admin, and has the same access to your primary data center as they do to your backup data center. It's all hosed at the same time. Another great one that I've seen plenty of times is an organization suffers a DDoS attack on their primary data center, it falls down, so it switches over to the secondary data center automatically. And the primary data center has all of this capacity and everything else, and the secondary data center is like 50% capacity or less, and it just instantly dies. And that's a really important thing for people to understand and to be able to promote that up to management. Like, you do need it. It's not wrong to do that, but people have to understand what it is not going to protect you against. So that's my myth.
I guess I'll try and tackle mitigating some of the effects of technological dependency doesn't always have to be performed with technology. I was part of an incident where it was very clear that the communications channels, the corporate communications channels, were compromised by the threat actor, including of the incident response team, like the ticketing system, the phones, et cetera. And this was a company that issued corporate phones to everyone. Luckily, a number of those people attended hacker camps together, EMF camp, CCC, these kinds of things. And so there were 3 or 4 of us who were familiar with the idea of just setting up a bar camp. And so we got across the street, we found a place that we knew. We said, look, we're going to use these tables, we're going to pay you a little extra money, can you bring us food when we need it? And we started working the incidents from a cafe and getting stuff done. And that helped a lot. And then there's also this kind of, I'm going to use an example from something else where I was at dinner in Turkey and the power went out. And it happens so frequently. The community is so used to it in this particular village that they just bring candles straight to the table. And so what I want to get across to you is that you don't always have to do everything technologically. Like Declan said, you can write things down, you can adapt, and you can solve technology problems in different ways, right? So like if I can't send the emails anymore, is there still some other way that I can communicate with the downstream providers to tell them that their orders won't arrive today? Get on the phone, phone up the truck drivers, figure out the logistics routes, get people adapting to the loss of technology that they usually depend on.
That reminds me of a time when I was with the retail ISAC, and I had some intel that came into me about an insider threat at a retailer who was not part of the ISAC. And I didn't have any way to contact them, and I didn't know where the insider was. So I couldn't just leave a voicemail, I couldn't send an email or whatever. So I had to go through LinkedIn and convince somebody else to convince the CISO to take my call. And then I said, do you have a fax machine? And he said, yeah. And I said, okay, we have a few. And I said, go pick one at random. Go stand in front of it, tell me what the number is, and I will fax you this intel that came in about your insider. Sometimes the old ways are the best.
I remember when fax machines were new.
They're still used very heavily in there are countries in the world that still fax legal documents, right? So
Yep.
Telex, yeah.
Eireann, you mentioned the word community when you were talking about your dinner in Turkey experience. We've been talking a lot about sort of like individual organizations and their resilience. How do we move from organizations and individual resilience to collective resilience, do you think? If that's, is that a concept that's pretty important? Do we need to be thinking about that? And what do we do, what are the ingredients to collective resilience from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I look forward to it. I feel like I can't
Thank you.
tackle all the different parts of it. Well, I mean, you do this well. It's like you're a pro or something. I guess I'll try and tackle just like small community or regional, and then we can scale up to national or something with the other participants. But the presentations that just preceded us, right? Jeffrey was here. He was talking about generating a scenario per week for cyber drills inside of a large company, medium-sized company, I guess, according to him. But doing like 80 different cyber drills inside the same company. And then immediately after, Eireann came in and did this wonderful presentation about doing resilience scenarios with all of the big businesses in Norway, or 50 small banks in a region or whatever. And I found like it was a great contrast between those two things. Like, a lot of people imagine incident response can be completed entirely within their own organization, and some incidents are like that. But take, for example, the one where I was involved, where the smart meters are down, and I have to collaborate with a third-party contractor of the person who's employed me in another language. You have to be able to collaborate across boundaries, and you have to collaborate with other people, and that community resilience becomes important. So I do believe that there are community practices that can be evolved, almost like volunteer fire department. Or I was talking to someone who's working in Bermuda, and he's like, look, we do hurricane drills. So if you look at a lot of natural catastrophe risks, we know how to build capabilities into our communities and respond to these things with practice. And not everybody has to be a perfect, super intelligent incident responder who understands every technology. They just need to know how to help and support the incident response team. So building community resilience, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So a little bit of context about me. I was heavily involved in establishing and running the New Zealand National CERT team. And to me, one of the really beneficial outcomes of having a CERT is to sort of be able to understand and share information really, really quickly about different attacks, what people are seeing, and all of that other kind of stuff. Because when you have that central hub that can collect and distribute information and resources about what's going on, it's so much easier if you're in an organisation, even just the CISO or the chief executive, the managers knowing that they're not alone in this. For example, like if you have a DDoS attack that's going across a sector, the fact that all CISOs can report up and say, it's not just us, everyone else is suffering this too, we're all sharing information, we're getting the best possible thing, all of our resources are pooled together to do this. And I think that that's sort of the one part of it, that pooling resources and sharing it. And I think that the other thing is understanding your supply chain. And when people talk about supply chain, they often think about critical national infrastructure and everything else. But I think also around core technological dependencies. And, there are some big obvious ones, like whenever Azure or AWS has a hiccup, like it can take down everything, right, at one go. And you might, from a sort of a national view down, you might go, okay, well, we've got all of these different companies doing X, therefore we've got redundancy, but all of them are relying on being able to log into their, SharePoint systems to do something. And if it all stops, and it stops for everyone at the same time. So that sort of supply chain thing is I think really, really critical, and there's so many different views to that.
Yeah, so just yesterday, the Internet Society and the Global Cyber Alliance announced a fund called the Common Good Cyber Fund, and its initiative to pull funding together to help nonprofits that support security for the common good, like the Shadow Server and other nonprofits. And FIRST is a member of this effort, along with some other ones. But that's one step that some organizations are taking to try to at least funnel more money to those nonprofits on whom we all depend. Now, there are a lot of other nonprofits who need this help too, especially on the cyber side. And they're like the other critical infrastructure, because if they can't practice their mission, then people don't get fed, they don't get rescued from human trafficking, they don't get the benefit of first responders during disasters and everything. So I think we have more work to do to help support nonprofits in general, but I'm really glad to see this Global Cyber Fund.
So it's interesting to me that this conversation, as it's been flowing, has really focused a lot on the people, out of people, process, and technology. We've talked very little about the technology behind resilience, which I think is probably appropriate, because technology is often what we're fighting against when we're dealing with these issues. But what do you think we could do around processes, and maybe talk through, like, if you've got any like recommendations for like exercise drills or something like that, like what you talked about 9/12, for example. Let's pull that thread a little bit and discuss like the process aspect of resilience and how can that be improved a little bit.
Well, if we could do one thing, and I've been asking for this for a long time, is to come up with some sort of ad hoc secure communication system that would work with anybody. Like when I had to contact this retailer out of the blue and say, no, really, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I have some important information for you. Can I talk to your security people? If we had a way to reach out to each other so that you wouldn't necessarily have to belong to a community to benefit from it. I think we have to start stepping outside of the community and reaching those people who either don't know, can't afford, don't know that this exists, but some way to reach out. When I was doing some threat intel sharing at the time, even Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center couldn't provide me with a working PGP key. So we need something better.
If I can interject, actually, I'm going to do a shout out to my own agency a little bit here, so
Oh, there you
pardon me.
go.
But we have something at CISA in the United States called the Pre-Ransomware Notification Initiative. So where we receive tippers from private security researchers about initial access brokers gaining access, because that's, I guess, their job. And we have ways of notifying the organization using side channels, otherwise known as people with boots on the ground in the states where these entities are located. So we actually have 50 some odd cybersecurity advisors located all across the United States. What we do is to avoid using an email system that's probably already compromised, to avoid using any other system that might be compromised, we literally send a guy in a truck to the location and knock on their door. Unless it's like, I think, U.S. Virgin Islands, where I don't think we have anybody, but we'll figure out a way to get that notification, but we have to throw people at the problem.
Yeah, I think communication systems adapt in different cultures, and so it can be very difficult to create a single system. I mean, we know PGP keys are not very usable. I love them, I'm not against them, but security usability has a real problem. And then cultural variability too. Like a lot of different communities don't like, using phones or using email or using things, and we have to kind of adapt to that and understand it when we're working in the context of different countries. So I'm going to propose something a little maybe odd and say that the entire challenge coin phenomenon of the first community is a really interesting way of introducing ourselves to others. And I think that there is a little bit of security infrastructure and trust infrastructure in there to be able to say, oh yeah, you were at the Fukuoka conference with me and we know each other. And so if I'm giving you this ransomware notification, at least you can look into it and think about it. So I know we don't usually think of challenge coins as a way of building trust and gamifying things in our community for a bigger purpose, but I genuinely think they are.
On the one thing question there, sort of going to that. One of the key things I think that organisations and people within organisations can do is really think about their organisation in terms of the consequences that they have to avoid. If you, as a technologist, it's really easy to sort of see everything of equal value across an organisation. You'll have some key systems and other bits and pieces, but from a business continuity, from a resilience perspective, if you understand like what really can't stop happening, or what are the functions that need to keep going all the time, that will help lift you away from the technology and thinking more about the ongoing operations and resilience of the organisation from a functional perspective. I think that's really a really helpful thing for an organisation to do. And the technical view from a technologist perspective is almost always different than the organisational view about what's important, especially when you consider like regulatory things and reporting and other bits and pieces. Having that understanding can be really, really critical.
But the problem, as I see it in a lot of these cases, is this will work great if you know what a challenge coin looks like first, and you already have that relationship where you've heard of the person who's heard of the person, but this doesn't help the 99% that Eireann was talking about, who don't even know who to call, what to ask. They don't have any security people. They just know there's something really wrong. And we always default to individual trust models that don't work that well. I know, Tom, one time somebody called me up and when I was at Cisco and said, I need to talk to somebody at CISA right now. I know it's after hours. Who can you get me to? And so, I think I got a hold of Victoria, who said she would dance on Brandon's desk until he agreed to call me back. But presenting that and building trust in a hurry during an emergency is, again, something that I think we need to be able to work on, something that's cross-community, cross-border, cross-sector, because you never know who you're going to have to call. And, at this point, even if I have trust relationships with some people, I would not expect everybody to take my call and say, no, she's from the United States. We're not talking to them right now. So, as things change, we need institutions that are more long-lived, that are more reliable than this, that everybody can know to call.
I think it's a lot easier to cross trust barriers with people when you ask them to do the job they already do, right? So if I'm asking you to do something that's outside your normal job function, it's a bit scary. But if I'm asking a pizza delivery guy to deliver pizzas to the ops room, like that works pretty easily. So look for people who already do a job that's similar to what you need in a particular incident. And I think that kind of resilience is underappreciated. Getting support for the incident response team in a basic needs met kind of way. What are our comms channels? What's our food? Where are we going to sleep? How do you pull people out of the incident and get them rest? All of that sort of stuff. But in a bigger picture, I think we also forget the kind of 4 ways that we manage risks as society. I think I just broke one of our rules. I said I wasn't going to mention risk, but risk avoidance is what you asked me to do. You didn't want me to mention the word risk, so you were trying to avoid it. That's what most societies do when faced with a problem. But you can also monitor a risk, and so talking about the resilience or the lack of resilience in a particular community or in a particular sector, and monitoring it and growing it and trying to measure it in some way, like with these exercises, is good. You can, of course, and I'm obligated to say this, transfer the risk as a cyber insurer. But cyber insurance doesn't have to be for-profit. It can also be cooperatives, right? A lot of cooperatives build together resilience, and they can build cyber defense communities. So transferring the risk is one opportunity as well. And then accepting the risk, right? Recognizing that there's no way we can really get rid of it, and finding a way to absorb the impact of that consequence. And I think a lot of organizations don't think about that. Like, how do we retain some capacity for the thing that's going to surprise us every month or every year or so on? And that might lead us into, low frequency but high impact events and how we deal with those as a society. Or also the circular dependency problems, right? I know what you mean. Look for the real dependencies, look for the real internal issues, but often they're circular. It's like the operating system depends on DNS, but the DNS depends on the file system. Or at a grander scale, the electrical system isn't isolated. It depends on finance because that's how we trade energy. So understanding that different critical infrastructures are dependent on each other is one of those tricky things when you're trying to deal with very, very large scale resilience.
So I like how you break things down into 4. I love whenever you can count on one hand the way you're going to break something down. It's always handy. And I know when we discussed this yesterday, you had 4 things that you were talking about. And do you want to expound on that right now? Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely. So I started doing incident response a really long time ago, and you get frustrated because you see the same things over and over and over. And so I started to pull the thread on that. And I sort of went from incident response to security architecture, because obviously, you want to build the systems that are going to be secure. You start doing that. And then I went from security architecture into more of like the business, so to speak, getting into governance and understanding that. Because I was like, keep on asking why until you get to the top. And then I started looking at like, what are the different strategies that organizations use in order to understand their own resilience needs, understand cybersecurity, the cybersecurity strategies that people have, and breaking those down into these 4 different kind of groups. And the first one is, I'm not here to make friends, it's hygiene and hope, right? Where you kind of do the things that you generally consider to be the right things that you do, and you just hope that nothing goes wrong because it's untested and it's a bit rough and you don't really understand what you're protecting. That's a kind of a fairly large group, and I was working with an organization about that, and I used that term, and the CISO pulled me into a room and he said, I'm not disagreeing with you, but you can never say that again. The next one is compliance-based, and this is quite common for government and for regulated industries and other bits and pieces. Their strategy is essentially take NIST, take whatever compliance thing that you have to do, and when they do a technology project or a business, or when they're measuring anything or reporting on anything, it's all based upon that kind of compliance thing. And the third one is essentially outsourced. This is very common for organizations that don't have a lot of technical capability. They might have some enormous vendor that comes in and rolls out all their laptops and does all their stuff, and they're like, this is a technology thing. That company is responsible for securing the technology that we have. Looking at these ways, it's not that you only do one of these things. It's that if you're in a situation where you have to make a choice about what it is that you're doing, there will be something that wins. And so, the last one that I think is a little bit different is threat and consequence based. And so that is when you sort of actively look at the threat environment and you actively look at the consequences that you must avoid, and you build the systems around that. And it's really interesting. New Zealand is having a strong economic downturn at the moment, and there are a lot of organisations that are having to change how they do things. Before, they could rely on compliance, but compliance has diminishing returns. If you're implementing everything in NIST, you're doing a whole bunch of stuff. How do you prioritize? How do you focus? How do you do what's sort of where? So you can start to blend in more of understanding your threats and understanding the consequences and all of that kind of stuff to sort of go in there. And I think that that really plays into the discussion today around resilience, because that feeds into your actual strategies of an organisation of how you're going through and doing all of this kind of stuff. Because there's nothing more frustrating as an organisation or as an incident response person to go into an organisation that has done everything right and still had a bad day. And that's very confusing for executives, and it's very difficult for stakeholders to have that kind of a conversation. And so I think that having that strategy and actually thinking about it allows you to understand and pivot and really build an organisation around the ability to keep doing what you're doing and get where you really need to go. Yeah, that's my story. If anyone wants to talk to me about that, this is what I look like, and I'm around, and I will talk about that forever.
I'll join you on that, and I'll hopefully maybe me and Wendy can gang up on you a little bit in a nice way.
Yeah.
Like each of those strategies, I think are really interesting, and I think we all recognize them. I think it characterizes beautifully the way that people kind of respond to these problems. But I think the point is that some of those strategies are right in certain situations, and then they're suddenly wrong because the context and everything else has changed. Like if you're living in a compliance-based or a compliance-captured risk function, for example, and then suddenly you're dealing with a threat, everything's really complicated. Or if you live in a world where there are threats, but they can't be monitored and you don't know when and where they're going to hit you, that threat and consequence thing becomes really hard because I can't quantify whether or not the threat actor is going to hit me, right? Like I hear that all the time. So yeah, I'll pull on that. Maybe Wendy can join me. Why do those strategies break down, and how do people fail to switch from one to the other when the context has changed?
Well, I think part of the answer to that lies in the fact that sometimes resilience is not getting back to 100%. Sometimes it's the ability to continue operating in a degraded capacity. And as you said, you have to pivot, you have to change your priorities on the fly and everything just to find that minimum viable operational capacity. And I would venture to guess that if you're working for a for-profit organization, the minimum viable functionality that you have to continue to support for resilience is the ability to take in money, the ability to charge. If you remember the Colonial Pipeline outage in the United States, it was, yeah, I was going to say, there's a lot you can't say about that.
You remember it?
Not at all.
Not at all. But it was my understanding that it wasn't that they could not make gas available. It was that they couldn't bill for it. And that's why they had to shut things down, because they couldn't charge for it.
I'll push back on that a little bit and say, I think I often see executives in a crisis worrying about revenue. And I try to remind them that if you can pay your employees and you can keep the organization in existence and you can maintain morale, then there is hope that you can make revenue again in the future. And that is actually more important than whether or not you're making revenue right at this particular moment. So maintaining
I would say good luck with explaining that to your CFO. I think that's the tough part.
It is tough.
It depends on what kind of management.
A lot of companies have to face the reality of not being able to make money from something for some period of time.
Oh, sure.
And so, if you push on it hard enough, I think they will recognize, oh, okay, this function isn't making money, but this other part of the business is making money. Yes, I want to get the money back, but if I can't maintain my employee base or my community, then I'm really, really going to go out of business. And getting them to refocus on that, at least temporarily in a crisis, helps.
I think that the really key part of that for me is that security is always just a function of time. And when you're thinking about resilience, that function of time becomes really, really important, because you can operate in a degraded state for a period of time where it is tolerable, and that becomes less and less tolerable as you go along. And so if you were having that if you were introducing that concept of what if we don't bill anymore to the CFO, you would probably want to have a very specific time frame that you could say, we've got 4 hours where we're going to be able to not to bill. At that point, we expect to be able to log so that we can bill, we can look at this retrospectively, but we might have a patch where we're blind or something to ease that conversation. But it's always, when you're thinking about that consequence stuff that I was talking about before, if you are an organization that, moves things around and you're like, okay, well, we're not going to know where our trucks are for a period of time, but our drivers know where they need to go or something like that, you can operate in that degraded state for a period after which it becomes too challenging or worse and worse and worse as you go. And I think that understanding that is really key to the resilience of an organization.
So we have used a couple of key terms, which I think is probably not the usual first conversation unless it's after hours, but we've already talked about risk, then we talked about money, and then Declan brought up time. So all of these are important categories and things that we measure. So how do we measure resilience? How do we know if we're getting better or worse?
That's a really good question.
I was going to say, I'm going to make Eireann go last on this one, though.
Oh, okay. I was going to say I was listening to the previous two presentations about exercises and thinking, well, how do you measure afterwards whether you're getting better? Do you have a better feeling about it? Do you say, okay, we were at a 1 and now we're at a 5? 5 what? How do you figure out whether you are getting better, and how do you keep that going, especially when there's a lot of staff turnover? You spend a lot of time exercising and training people and working on processes, and then a new executive comes in and says, right, we're throwing that all out and we're going to do everything differently. I really don't know.
How you measure security in an organization is probably the most challenging thing, really, when you think about in an organizational context, not in a technical context, in an organizational context, because it drives every behavior in an organization. And we've all seen and heard and probably worked for organizations where the things that were being measured were poor for either the health or the hygiene of the organization. And, you know, as security professionals, we've all seen decisions made that were detrimental to security. So I think of measures as, you know, you need to look top down and bottom up. And from an organisational perspective, looking at resilience, you can break it down into, you know, simple things of, do you know, have you got your consequences mapped? Is it up to date? Do people agree with it? Have you practiced it? All of those kinds of things. And when you're down in a more granular sense, I think that there are two different tracks of measurements that are important. One of them is measuring what you are doing, the work done, and that can be like implement X controls and uplift this and do these things and build technical redundancy, all that kind of stuff, that work done. But you also need to measure you against the raw risk of the broader landscape, because you can do everything right? You can have a firewall that you have a 14-day SLA for critical patching, right? And you can hit that every single day of the year, but you've still got a lot of time when you're vulnerable to an O-day attack in your SSL VPN attached to your firewall. And so your raw risk can be read whilst everything that you're doing is right. And if you establish the framework of doing that in your measurements, then that's an easier conversation with your executives when you have a bad day and you have to explain why.
But I don't like some of the very simplistic metrics that we use a lot, like mean time to respond, because you're responding to apples and oranges. Depending on what kind of incident it is, they may be totally different time frames for response. I did some research at one point together with the Scientia Institute, and we found that for example, mean time to respond went up if you have a security operations that is partly outsourced. Does it mean you should not do the outsourcing because it takes that much longer to respond because there are two organizations involved? Maybe not necessarily. So I just wouldn't try to take these overly simplistic metrics just because they're easier to count.
I'll try and characterize two things. One, if you're not measuring people or people's experience, you're probably going to go wrong. I'll use an example from the London Underground and the train system in Britain, where they were measuring the number of passengers on trains, average number of passengers on trains. And if you think about that, that's a train-centric metric. And so what they were finding is that most trains don't have people on them. But then someone realized that they wanted to measure the customer experience. And it turned out that most people are on a crowded train. And so both of those things can be true, right? And if you're measuring the average number of people on a train, you might come to the conclusion that you are over-provisioning trains and reduce the resilience of our society by taking trains out of operation. Whereas if you measure that most people are riding trains that are full, then you might come to the opposite conclusion. And so getting the metric wrong can be really, really dangerous. And that's why I encourage anyone measuring anything to think about people's experience. Going back to your point, you might be responding quickly, and that might be great for the incident response team and true, and they're showing some good metrics. But if they arrive at the scene with the wrong tools, or people are still unable to do their jobs after the responses arrived, then we're not hitting those targets. So try and measure those things. The second story I'd like to tell briefly is one of incentives. It's really easy to get incentives wrong. Anytime someone suggests incentivizing behavior, I caution them. Like, you have to examine the wider incentives at play when you do that. And if you consider other people's incentives when you measure resilience, I think it can be helpful. So the example I love to give is called the Cobra effect. So The British government at one point in time was in India governing a city, and there were cobras biting people, and people were dying, and so they decided, in their infinite wisdom, to offer a bounty on cobras. And they paid out money to people who brought them dead cobras, and this continued to happen and continued to happen and continued to happen. And someone doing the measurement realized that the number of cobras wasn't really going down, and this sort of surprised everyone. And then they realized that people were farming cobras and selling them to the governors of the state, which makes perfect sense when you stop to think about incentives. And again, they made another mistake where they decided, okay, we've been really stupid, and so we will stop paying for dead cobras. So they released them into the street, and the death rate went up, right? So whenever you're trying to do incentive engineering, you have to stop and remember that no incentive exists in isolation. It exists in a context of multiple other incentives at the same time. If you would indulge me, I could also go into the NERC SIP story, but I don't know. Have I taken too much airtime?
I think yeah, I want to let the audience ask a couple questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move into our final round. We'll go with Declan first, then you, Eireann, and then Wendy. I'll let you have the last word.
It's the right order.
The one key takeaway that you want the audience to have about cyber resilience.
My one key takeaway that I was going to say was around understand the consequences to your organisation that you need to mitigate. But I've kind of already belted on about that a little bit. So I'm going to say something a little bit different. And that is, once you've, as long as you have done that consequence analysis, don't overcook it. So when I was a part of setting up the New Zealand National Cert, there was a lot of discussion of redundancy in terms of attacks and cybers, and New Zealand has a lot of earthquakes and floods and all sorts of shenanigans. It's a beautiful place. It's testament to how pretty it is that people live there. But we had a fallback that was simply envelopes with printouts of procedures and people's contact details, a notepad and 2 pens. And that was our cert in a bag. And, the key people had one in their house and one in their car. And at any point in time, we could just be a cert. And if it meant you just putting a piece of paper down on the bonnet of some car that you happened to be standing next to when you got a phone call that there was something going on, the cybers were happening, then that allowed us to continue to operate. And we were a functional cert. And I think that it's really easy to have complex technical solutions that are incredibly expensive. But once you really understand your business requirements, what it is that you need to do, and then come up with the simplest and most effective method of doing that, I think that that's absolutely key.
Eireann?
I think I'll go with a phrase that exists in my team, which is blame burns restoration. So if you start to have some situation where someone's like, well, why doesn't this work? And why didn't you do this? And blah, blah, blah. You need to very quickly turn that situation around and get everyone refocused on restoration or, getting the mission back on track, not operating in a degraded manner. And I'd say that's something I really want you to take away. And one other point I'll squeeze in is don't assume resilience doesn't exist. Hunt for it, look for it, find it in the room, find it with the people you're working with, find it in the cultural values. A lot of people do great resilience as societies, and it's easy to overlook it because we do it so well in so many other ways other than cyber. So we can learn a lot from looking at resilience from other domains and bring it home to digital resilience.
That was beautifully set up. Thank you, Eireann. Because I think what we've been touching on over and over and over again is the human part of resilience, which I think is exactly right, because the technology is going to change all the time out from under us, but there is a human cost to being resilient. I myself battled breast cancer. I took care of both my parents for years until they passed away. I lost my husband to brain cancer. I got long COVID. There are a lot of things that continue to happen, and you may never make it back to 100%. And that's not how resilience works. It's continuing to carry on no matter what level you're at, because that's what you have to do. And that's why it's so important for us to do this together.
All right, and with that, we can turn it over to the audience for any questions you may have. The microphones are on either end of the stage, so please step up if you have any questions for the panel.
And if the microphones don't work, just yell really loud.
So thank you very much. I want to bring in one question here, and that is, what's the relationship between resilience and complexity? Is this killing us? Is it helping us? What should we go for the simple one, or can we kind of like, is it even possible to get more resilient by having a more complex setup, or is it just a fallacy?
It's a very, very deep cut. It's a brilliant question, and it's so hard to answer, which I think is why I'll get in there first. Complex adaptive systems, in like a sort of academic sense, evolved to help us deal with these kinds of societal problems, right? Like, to some degree, the internet has been evolved so that we can handle natural disasters and continue to function as societies. And that, in turn, introduces more complexity, right? And then we don't really understand always how those systems work, or at least I don't. You know, I very much have to explain to everyone in my team, like, explain it to me like I'm 5. Yes, I'm an incident responder, but, you know, I'm not up to date on technologies, and you know more as a junior incident responder about these technologies than I do. So you have to explain some of that complexity to me, and I have to make decisions in an uncertain way, in an uncertain place, and I will be wrong, and some of the analysis will be wrong, and some of the information I've been given will be wrong. So dealing with complexity for me is about decision making in the face of uncertainty, and doing that with everybody operating to the best they can. But handling the complexity of modern day life is, I don't know, it's increasingly challenging. And I find my home life doesn't stop when I'm working the incident, and the incidents don't stop when I'm at home with the kids, and it's just kind of all the time. And that's why, as a community, we have to really support each other. I know so many incident responders that help each other move or deal with other complexities. The simultaneity of it all is the way I like to think of it. But complexity of risk management helps us, and complexity of systems that we have to debug and fix is definitely a challenge.
I just want to jump on. Beautiful answer. I want to talk specifically around the technology side of it. I firmly believe, and this is almost religious, that simplicity is a tenet of security from an architectural perspective. When I was an architect doing system designs and other bits and pieces, every single day, the most important question was, is this the simplest, most elegant way of solving this problem? Right? And if it's not, go back and try again, do better, do more. If you don't understand how a system works, you can't secure it, you can't work with it, you can't, there's, you know, it really is very, very difficult. And one of the things, in a project perspective, if you look at all of the requirements, if you go through all of your system requirements, your NFRs and your functionals and everything else, and then you might find that there are only 2 or 3 requirements that result in the majority of complexity of a system. And one of the things that I used to do as an architect was go back to the business and say, hey, look, this requirement here and this requirement here is 80% of the cost and complexity of this system because of this and this and this. Do you really need this? And several times when I was doing that, people were like, we actually don't need that. We just put it in there because someone was an idea and we thought that it might be nice, so we threw it down. And I was able to just go, fantastic, I'm going to red pen that, and this is going to be a great day for everybody. So yeah, push back on complexity at all times.
Yeah, and I think in general, when we're responding to an event, we tend to fall back to simplicity. Part of that is prioritization. Like, can we just get the lights back on? Mm-hmm. And we tend to think, you know, in those terms, what's the next thing that we can do in the step, because we can't do everything at once. So simplicity can lead to better outcomes, and sometimes it can lead to people degrading security because they're going to do something that's a lot easier than the way you normally do it. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. But yeah, I agree with the complexity that we have these days. I think it's a really good idea to look at our resilience, you know, with an eye towards what can we get rid of, either temporarily or permanently?
Any other
Bugging happens at a societal level now. That's basically what I think. And you have to do it across boundaries of organizations or countries or whatever. So even when you're just trying to get the lights back on, you figure out you have to call, truck drivers to figure out how the supplies are going to arrive to get the fuel to whatever. So yeah, debugging has to be done by communities, not just individuals in tiny little computers.
But that makes it more complex on the
Right.
on
Right.
the other hand
Yeah.
too.
Any other questions from the audience?
Hey, Tom, up here. We got
Oh,
Mike's
hey.
up here too. Derek Scholl. So last year at the conference, it felt like every other talk had AI in its title somewhere. There are a lot fewer of them this time.
Oh, ouch.
But you know exactly where this is going. But the first two times this week, yesterday, I heard AI mentioned. The presenter was basically dismissing it as buzzwords, and I'm pretty sure they're going to get run over in the next 3 years. But then we listened to Jeff Carpenter, and he's using AI to take a 2+ hour exercise to design a scenario and has figured out how to do it in 20 minutes. And those are going to be the success stories. What potential do you see, or how do you think we might benefit from using AI for resilience?
Mapping those dependencies that we struggle to see already, that might be a good one. I'm a firm believer of smart people assisted by AI. That's kind of how I run my team, is, use AI as wisely as you can and question sometimes the advice it gives you, just like we question other members of our team. So it's about the accountability, really. But yeah, AI as an assistant to people who already do good work, I'm a fan.
If you know the answer, it can get you there faster.
That's true. I was going to say, in the cases where I've heard of LLMs usage or other types of AI actually working, can we just call it automation? And just take all the sparkly stuff off and just say, we've managed to automate this in a better way. I'm definitely in favor of that. But I think especially in the cases of resilience where we are jumping out of our context and we are hurriedly trying to put something together that is not working the way it's supposed to, I don't see how automating that response, whether it's using a model or the other type of automation, I don't see how that's going to work in a situation where you have nothing but exceptions going on.
Yeah, in terms of soapboxing about simplicity, as I was just doing. I've been sitting here trying not to say something and I failed.
Come on.
You're here to say something.
Yeah. There are some real downsides to using AI, and if an organisation becomes over-reliant on it, and the people that are working there become less practiced in going through and making their decisions and understanding what's going on, if you have decay over time and you don't have quality systems built into things to understand that if what you're getting out of it is being less useful for whatever task you're using it for. If you have less ability to look inside something and understand how it works, that is going to impact the resilience of your organisation, because you've lost the ability to do that function. And I'll do a quick parallel for organisations that have outsourced their security providers, like an MSSP or something that comes in and runs their SOC or other bits and pieces. It becomes increasingly difficult for that organisation to effectively manage that relationship in terms of monitoring and holding to account and doing all these things, because naturally they lose the people that understand what the words mean and the value and everything else over time. And then eventually, unless they have a really good organisation that they've outsourced to, that decay can get to a point where it causes a problem. And I can't help but feel that there will be use cases for AI in organisations that have the same issue.
AI is a pretty wonderful user interface. At least LLMs, right?
Can we keep the natural language part?
Yeah.
Yeah, we could do that. Maybe.
But we're not here to talk about AI. I mean, the resilience problem you mentioned is the same, right? Like, people can overdepend on chatbots, LLMs. They can overdepend on DNS. They can overdepend on, public key infrastructures and not maintain them. To me, this is a lot about infrastructure. We love to not maintain infrastructure as society, right? Like, your understanding of infrastructure is like in opposite proportion to how invisible it is. You know, the electricity just arrives. I don't even see the copper wires anymore. You know, the internet just arrives. I type in a password. Like, thinking about the infrastructures that support us and finding ways to maintain them, I think that matters. But I sense another question.
I think actually you've held on to the ball long enough, and we are now at time. Yeah.
We've got 12, 10,
Yeah.
11, 10.
Killed the clock, man. Good job. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. Hope you enjoyed the panel, and enjoy lunch.